Okay, so I guess we'll get started. So far, it's just me and Kira here. I'm going to say some stuff out loud just so that you can know that we're having a conversation, because her microphone doesn't work, so we're just going to have to type some stuff back and forth. So we're actually supposed to start off with a prayer, so I'll go ahead and say that. That way she doesn't have to type a prayer in. I don't think that'd work very well. So, our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this day. We're grateful for the opportunity we have to meet together as a group and to discuss the case study for the week. Please bless the members of the group who could not be here this week, that they will be able to learn the material and have useful insights for themselves. And these things we say in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So, start off with a quick overview of what we read. So our case study this week was about Thomas Green, obviously, and his struggles after he had a pretty fast promotion at Dynamic something. What was the name of the place? Dynamic Designs, that's right. Thank you. And so him and his boss, Frank Davis, they didn't get along. Frank was actually not able to hire Thomas. Thomas was hired by Shannon McDonald, who is the VP of their division. And so she hired Thomas without consulting with Frank first. And so I have a feeling that kind of contributed to their poor relationship. And so there's been a pretty big conflict going on, and Thomas Green is concerned that his boss is building a case to fire him, and that Thomas Green's situation, where if he fails to adapt to what's going on, it'll probably lead to him being fired. So our first question, I guess, as we talk about this or chat here, is what do you think are some of the key issues going on with this case? So Kara here is saying that jealousy was probably a big root of some of the negativity, and I agree with that. Thomas was kind of a young gun that, even though he was doing really well at what he was doing before, he kind of skipped a bunch of people over for a promotion. And so I don't think Frank appreciated that very much, because even in the case study, it said that Frank probably wouldn't have hired Thomas for that position. So. Okay. Yeah, so Kira's saying he only had one interview with Shannon, which was probably threatening to Frank. So, so we're kind of the next part here. So if you were Shannon, would you have hired Thomas Green? Why or why not? I kind of agree with you there. If I was Shannon, I probably wouldn't have hired Thomas so quickly into that role. I probably would have hired one of the other marketing managers or the next step up. So the step that he skipped, and I probably would have put them in the position because they would have had much more experience, especially with Frank, in terms of how things were supposed to be run. Whereas I feel like that's one of the reasons that Thomas was struggling so hard was he wasn't used to the culture in the company. And so I probably wouldn't have hired him either. I probably would have stayed in-house as well. Yeah, so I mean, I understand the appeal for Shannon, right? The appeal that I mean, Thomas was just blowing away in sales. I mean, he was just kind of dominating there. So I understand the appeal of wanting to hire somebody to come in and kind of shake things up and possibly, get you a huge boost in sales. But it seems like that wasn't the best idea in retrospect, considering all the problems that they had. So, like you said, it's usually a red flag when people, when everyone else is is over 10 years older than you. So, let's see here. Kind of asks us to describe who Frank is and then describe who Thomas is. So we'll start with Frank. So who is Frank and kind of what does he value? What is his end game with running the show? Ambitious. Okay. He's ambitious, put himself out there, whether he failed or succeeded. Yes, I would agree. He was a very hard worker. He had very high expectations. Is how I'd kind of sum up what you're saying there. And just another note. So he was a hard worker and he excelled above the rest. Just found a way to stand out. Yeah. One other note that I would make about Frank Davis was he's very detail oriented. So with things like scheduling and reports and presentations, he required all that stuff and he expected all that stuff from people that worked for him. And I believe that's one of the big problems between him and Thomas is also a very successful person who works very hard. But what he values is, the sale is reading people in person and, just kind of doing things on the fly, which he's very good at. I mean, his record in sales attests to that. And then his end goal is to be a game changer. He wants to change things, is what Thomas wants to do, whereas Frank wants to kind of keep things at the same pace and not really change much. Thomas isn't so detail oriented or focused on that stuff and keeping people updated about what's going on. He just kind of keeps it all up in his head and doesn't really share with people. Yeah. So in your opinion, who do you think is mostly at fault for their current situation? Do you think it's Frank? Do you think it's Thomas? Do you think it's Shannon? I think it's Shannon. So Shannon's fault for putting them both in a bad position. It was a little irresponsible. I can agree with you there. I'm not sure I would place. I'm not sure I would say she's mostly at fault for putting for the situation. I think she's partially responsible for sure, because she probably should have talked to Frank. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. She probably should have talked with Frank before hiring Thomas. But in my mind, who I think is mostly at fault for the current situation, I actually blame Thomas mostly, because I mean he's basically directly defying his boss, even though he doesn't agree, especially with the sales figures. I think that's the main issue that Thomas has with Frank is those highly inflated sales figures that he doesn't think he's going to meet, and so he knows he's going to be held responsible if he doesn't meet those goals. But he doesn't take any. I mean, other than publicly disagreeing with Frank in the meeting, he doesn't take any steps to try and show Frank that his figures are inflated or anything like that. Even though he claims he has evidence that it's not gonna. If he had just listened to Frank and put together some reports and some presentations, then he could have shown it to him. That's exactly what Frank was asking, was just to keep updated on what the situation was. So, I mean, and then Thomas was just failing to do anything of that nature. So, but I mean, I can see it both ways. I can definitely see what you're saying, that Shannon just kind of made a spur of the moment decision to hire Thomas. And so, yeah, it's kind of hard to look at it from Frank's perspective because we're hearing it mostly from Thomas's. So, so next question here is, if you were Thomas, what would you do? Mm-hmm. Is there any? So you would have stepped down. Is there any reason in particular? Like, would you step down and try to go to another position within the company, or would you just step down and go and find a whole new job? So step down, keep a little dignity in your reputation, and then just leave altogether. I mean, that he is building a pretty bad reputation for himself by disagreeing with Frank. And then it mentions multiple times that he's kind of talking with coworkers, kind of bad-mouthing Frank behind his back, saying that, things aren't, Frank doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, I can understand that, not wanting to wait around and then just have it be a complete waste of time. Yeah, that'd be pretty frustrating. So, if I were Thomas, I mean, I don't see Thomas doing this, and I kind of wrote this up in my case study, but if I were Thomas, I would concede to some of Frank's requests. I would try to meet more personally with Frank, in some of those more personal meeting type situations where they do a review of his work and stuff like that, and kind of lay out the issues and be like, okay, I'm gonna start doing these reports that you asked me for and stuff like that. Try to get some hard sales forecasts and stuff like that for you. But in the meantime, you're gonna have to cut me some slack. I kind of have a different style than you. I think they can make it work, but it's going to take some leeway on both sides. And I think Thomas kind of has to take a big humility pill and just kind of start doing things the way Frank kind of expects them to be done, at least for a little while. Yeah, I see it as very unrealistic as well. And Thomas, yeah, I think it's very hard for them to have a genuine conversation. So I don't see my situation happening, but me personally, just my personality, be it because of where I work, it's very expected that if you have a problem with someone or something going on, that you're vocal with them about it, that you don't call them out publicly, but you kind of take each other to the side, and when other people aren't really watching the drama, you kind of hash out the issues. So that's my personal beliefs with things. But Thomas and Frank seem to be two very different people, whereas Thomas is very kind of publicly going about things. Frank kind of goes around Thomas and goes straight to Shannon when he has problems and stuff like that, instead of addressing them directly with Frank. And Frank kind of, yeah, so good stuff. So we're kind of supposed to shift our focus into the emphasis of power and office politics and how those kind of come into play. Sorry, I just read your comment. They're like teenage girls. So, so as far as office politics and power in the office and stuff like that, how do you think that sort of stuff comes into play? Yeah, I mean, you can't deny that it's not political at all. Otherwise, Thomas wouldn't have gotten to where he was. He kind of played the politics game with Shannon, and that's kind of how he got his position. So and he played his relationship up with Shannon. It mentioned that they went to the so yeah, it mentioned that they went to the same college and stuff like that. And so he kind of had an in with her, and they developed a really good relationship, which kind of allowed him to bypass Frank. So, so he kind of leveraged that into his promotion. Here it talks about referent power, which is basically the linkages between key results and characteristics. So, yeah, people are in everything, unfortunately. So, I think Thomas had a lot of the what they're calling here referent power, where he had a lot of results and a lot of good characteristics, which kind of gave him some power in the office, some control about what was going on. That's how he got his position and stuff like that. So Yeah, definitely very popular. And that's politics right there. That's politics 101. You got to get people to like you. So, yeah, I'm not sure that people in the office necessarily liked Frank either, although he had the results to kind of back him up. You know, he had been doing very well at his job for a long time, so they didn't specifically mention anything, but I mean, so and then another hint here is legitimate power, so given through position or rank or seniority. So I mean, obviously Frank and Shannon have the legitimate power in this situation because their positions and ranks and seniority are all higher than Thomas. So Thomas has to find other methods to kind of get things done. Yeah, for sure. I think the fact that he wants to be the best and he wants to be number one so bad, it gets in the way of him being able to work effectively on a team. And I know that's kind of what I don't know if you've done any of the reading this week in the book, the five dysfunctions. So, I mean, in the reading, it talks about ego specifically and how that was affecting their group. Um, so, I mean, when you take it into Thomas's perspective, he kind of has that ego. He doesn't want to. All he cares about are his results, and he doesn't care about the group together doing well. So, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it. No, you're you're fine with your spelling. I understood what you're saying. So I remember in the reading, it specifically, um, I can't remember their names right now, but they specifically said, you know, ego isn't necessarily bad. It's when your own personal ego gets bigger than the team's ego. So when you care more about yourself than about the team doing well, that's when it really becomes detrimental. So yeah, that's definitely happening here. So the last thing is talk about coercive power. So the ability to coerce people or to have consequences or and influence other people's actions. Um, do you think Thomas was trying to coerce anybody, or do you think Frank was trying to do some coercion and force some actions to happen? Yeah. So I mean, when you read the emails from Frank, you definitely get that vibe that Frank was trying to coerce Shannon into doing what he wanted, which was basically firing Thomas. Thomas was, yeah. There's a little blurb at the end that I'm going to talk about, um, where Thomas definitely tried to use coercion to get his way. And yeah, I just wanted to prove Frank wrong. But Frank was definitely using Shannon to kind of get what he wanted, by sending out those emails and saying that Thomas wasn't doing his thing and that if he didn't correct his wrongs. So yeah. And I mentioned this in my case study as well, is I think a lot of the problems could be solved if the three of them were to just go into a room, you know, meet in someone's office or a conference room and just kind of talk about the issues. Because then, you know, whether Shannon's the mediator which I would assume she would have to be because she's the one who hired Thomas, and she's the one who's in charge of Frank. So she would kind of have to mediate the conversation so that each person could get what they wanted, and no one really takes advantage of the other one. So what do you think? Yeah, definitely need some humility in everyone's case. So another question here, what do you think their kind of styles of conflict are? Like, how do you think each of them addresses conflict? Passive aggressively, yeah. Do you think, yeah, more so with Frank, do you think Thomas and Frank address conflict differently? Some ways yes, in some ways no. Yeah. Kind of my opinion is I think they go about it kind of differently, whereas Frank was, I mean, Frank isn't super vocal all the time, but Frank did meet with Thomas and did tell Thomas what he wanted him to improve. So he was vocal with Thomas. He did confront Thomas personally about what was going on, whereas Thomas just kind of sat there in the meetings and listened. He didn't really have a back and forth with Frank. He didn't address his concerns with Frank. He just told Frank, or he just kind of went along with what Frank was saying. So he was kind of quiet about it, but he would go and talk to other people in the office about the issues, but he wouldn't talk with it directly with Frank. And then Frank, instead of, confronting Thomas directly later on, decided to go through Shannon, which I think kind of was an issue with Thomas, that he wasn't willing to confront him personally about what was going on. So, and then, tattled on him. It's like they're on the playground. Another trait that Thomas was kind of employing, and they mentioned it as well, is Thomas was actively avoiding Frank, other than when they had their meetings. So instead of confront him about the issues, he just avoided him altogether so that he didn't have to deal with them, which I think is kind of stupid, but it's okay. Yeah. So if you're reading it from Thomas's side, then Frank looks like a real jerk. That's for sure. So in terms of Thomas's situation, knowing that all we've done now, do you think Thomas should still step aside and try his options elsewhere, or do you think he should employ some sort of tactics in the office to kind of get his way? Do you think he should go straight to Shannon, kind of go back over Frank's head like Frank was doing to him, or since you were saying you're on Thomas's side there? develop a relationship with his coworkers and learn from there. Yeah, I think that would help him as well. Is talk to the other people who work with Frank and figure out what Frank wants. Because I'm sure Thomas isn't the only person working with Frank. I'm sure Frank has other people underneath him. So I think it would be good for him to go around and get to know everyone else and, kind of figure out what to do with the whole situation. Yeah. So that kind of goes into our next question here. What can he do to salvage the situation? So let's say he wants to stay, he likes his position, he doesn't want to go anywhere. What can he do? What are his options? And so we already talked about one option there, which was go around to his other coworkers, kind of work with them. So listen to Frank more. But so we've kind of decided, like, let's say that Frank kind of has it out for him. So, no matter what he does for Frank's never going to be pleased with what Thomas does, which is a very real possibility. Let's say Frank just doesn't want to get along. Is there anything Thomas can do in that situation that's going to help him to keep his job? You would leave. But let's say he wants to keep his job. So you don't think there's anything he can do at that point? Move somewhere else that he isn't under Frank. So, maybe form some relationships with some other people in different departments and kind of lateral over somewhere else. That's a possibility. So okay, do something where he can develop more experience but not be around Frank. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a big thing is he needs to develop some serious experience before he continues on in his role. So let's see, where are we at here? So how do you think we personally can deal with situations like this at work? Say we were caught in a situation where we got a big promotion, and we ran into a boss that either didn't like us or didn't think we were good enough for the position. So, I mean, I know we've kind of already talked about that, but serving people that hate you works wonders. That's a good gospel connection as well. Kill them with kindness, definitely. So, I mean, that's one of those things where you show them you're kind of willing to do whatever, and then that changes their whole outlook on you. Because, I mean, it could very well be that Frank looks at Thomas as a threat and that Thomas is out to get his job. And so he may think that Thomas is trying to undermine him. And so if Thomas puts forth a little bit of goodwill and serves Frank a little bit, like you were saying, that, you know, it would kind of put some of those fears at rest for Frank and be like, hey, Thomas isn't such a bad guy. He's not gunning for my job. He's just a real big go-getter. And so he's got big ideas and big plans. And so, you know, let's try and use some of that ambition for good and get him doing the right thing. Perfect. So just kind of go over what we were talking about here. So we kind of had the conclusion that Thomas and Frank need to find some middle ground. Otherwise, you suggest that Thomas kind of step down from his position. In that case, you know, I think it'd be Thomas to kind of work with his coworkers and understand and figure out what Frank expects of him and what Frank wants from him, and do what you were saying is, you know, do everything that Frank asks, kind of serve him and make sure that he's happy. And then later on, that'll kind of help him build a reputation that he's a good person. He's not out there trying to gun for people's jobs and stuff like that. And it'll help keep Shannon on his side, you know, whereas I think Shannon was kind of starting to lean more towards Frank's side. So definitely something to think about. Sorry about my dogs there. I'm going to share with you this last part that it asked me to share. So it's Thomas Green, the rest of the story. So after Shannon McDonald's February 5th, 2008 email, so after she emailed Thomas, Green took the offensive against his boss. He crafted a series of memorandums, emails, reports, and projections that exposed inaccuracies in creative forecasting. This data enabled Green to build some alliances with other marketing personnel who used the data to ultimately side with him. On April 4th, it was announced that Frank Davis was being moved laterally to an undefined special project. However, Green's tactics were seen as overly brutal by many in the company, and although he won the battle against his boss, his career was irreparably harmed. McDonald distanced herself from him. By July of 2008, Green announced he was resigning from his position to pursue full-time studies for an MBA. Yeah, for sure. We can only speculate what would have occurred if Green had tried to help Davis work out the discrepancies and problems with forecasts. Perhaps both would have succeeded. So, yeah, that was kind of an unexpected outcome. Yeah, it was starting to sound real good when I was reading it, and then all of a sudden it just kind of, like you said, it damaged his reputation. You know, he's kind of building that bad rap. Yeah, it sounded like everyone kind of lost. Yes, that is my baby, and I was just talking to my wife. You want to see her? Here, let's show the whole group my baby.
She's just so cute.
Earn us some extra points here. Say hi. So, I mean, that's pretty much what we were supposed to talk about this week. We've been going for almost an hour now. So we got started a little late. Thanks for coming. I'm going to email the link to everyone, and then I'll post it in the discussion board as well for her to see, and hopefully we can get some emails going back and forth, and we can kind of get some of the other groups' input about what should be going on. So thanks for showing up.